My dear students and colleagues, Assalamu alaikum and very good afternoon and Ramadan Mubarak. I welcome you all to our today's lecture class, which will be taken by Dr. Zina Makhiza, who is MD, MRCS, FRCS from Glasgow, and she did her fellowship from Mayo Clinic. Currently, she is the senior consultant cardiothoracic surgeon in Care Hospital Group, Hyderabad, India. About her educational background, she passed MBBS from Lady Hardinge Medical College, Delhi, India in 2001, and then she did her residency in general surgery in Maulana Azad Medical College. Then she did MRCS from Edinburgh, UK, and FRCS from Glasgow in 2006. From 2009 to 2011, she had completed her fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery from Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota. She had many certifications. I can tell about one or two important, like certification on bypass, balloon pump, etc. in 2008. Then care of critically ill surgical patient 2007. And then basic surgical skill in 2005, advanced life support in 2005, which are very important and basic things for becoming a surgeon, especially cardiac surgeon. And she had many honors and awards. In 2015, she won first prize for the best paper in congenital cardiac surgery in Edinburgh, UK. In 2012, she was nominated as the Young Investigator Award in PCSI Chennai, India. And she had a lot of other awards. Published articles, she had 28 published articles. Oral presentation in home and abroad is about 27. Poster presentation is like 14. She is associated with many charity activities. So she works with the Little Heart, Healing Little Hearts, and traveled with them as lead surgeon to Africa since 2018. She is also actively involved in getting Afghan patient to India under low-cost scheme of treatment, and also involved in operating Indian children under low-cost government scheme. And associated with the Felicitate, she is also coming to Bangladesh, and currently project is off due to COVID pandemic. And she is the member of many societies, important of whose are Minnesota Medical Education and the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. So with this, I would like to invite our today's teacher or faculty, Dr. Zina Makhiza, to start her presentation. Thank you. Dr. Zina.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for felicitating me and inviting me and giving me this opportunity to take a lecture here. This will be a learning opportunity for me as well. So today's topic is fluid and electrolyte management in post-operative period after congenital cardiac surgery. We'll try to stick to the basics. We'll not go in details of many complications or how each and every case has to be managed. So this is a broader perspective today that I'll be presenting and trying to teach here. So as we all know, water is the most plentiful constituent of the human body. Approximately 75% of birth weight for a term infant is water. But by the end of first year of life, it decreases to approximately 60%. And it basically remains at this level until puberty. So the importance of telling you this is to tell you the importance of how important it is to manage the fluids properly in a post-operative cardiac surgery patient. So total body water is divided between two main compartments. One is intracellular fluid, the other one is
Zina,
extracellular fluid.
Yes, Zina, we are not seeing your slide. Slide, please. Are you sharing your slide?
Yes, ma'am, but I will.
We are not seeing your slides yet.
Why?
We need to again slide share.
Yes, I share screen. This is the presentation. Share. Can you see it now?
Yeah. Now we are seeing.
Okay, I'll just go again. Okay. So can you see it now, everyone?
Yes.
All right.
Please proceed.
Okay. So this is the first slide where I basically told that the 75% of our birth weight at term for a term infant is water, but it decreases to 60% by the end of first year of life. So that's why the management of fluids and electrolytes in a post-operative cardiac surgical patient is very important. Now, total body water is divided between two main compartments, intracellular and extracellular. So extracellular fluid is what we call as plasma, interstitial fluid, and transcellular fluid. As we know, plasma is very important. We all know the blood and all its components. But the fluid compartments and their volumes, they change with age. As we can see here, there are 4 columns, starting from left for a premature, to neonate, to infant, to adult. So as the age increases, we will see that the extracellular fluid decreases in the body. Plasma remains more or less constant at 5. The intracellular fluid increases, and also, so the total components also, they decrease. So for a premature infant, it is like 85% of body weight at birth is water. It remains only 65% in an adult. Now, as we all must have read in MBBS, transcellular fluid is fluids which are present in cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid, digestive juices, intraocular, pleural, and pericardial and peritoneal fluids. Now, the last two, in fact, last 3, pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal, are important from a cardiac surgical patient's point of view. Now, just to give an oversight of the electrolyte compositions of bodily fluids, so we are seeing here on this slide the composition of plasma, ECF, and ICF. As we can see, the composition of plasma and ECF is comparable in terms of the amount of sodium and potassium present, which is the most important 2 electrolytes that we manage post-operatively. But the levels of magnesium are also important, and we often have to take into consideration calcium levels also. As we can see, more calcium is present in plasma as compared to the extracellular fluid overall. And it is the amount of ionized calcium that we will be concerned with in the management of pediatric congenital cardiac surgical patients, because it is the calcium which drives your myocardium and its contractility. So it's very important to keep an eye on the levels of calcium also, although we sometimes do tend to ignore that. Now, how do we determine fluid requirements in a child? Now, there have been various concepts. In 1911, it was Holland who proposed that based on the energy consumption in children, you should calculate the fluids. But in 1957, this concept was modified by 2 scientists, Holliday and Sager, who correlated that this calorie requirement should be correlated with the basal metabolism and the active energy needs. So obviously, the fluid requirements for a child who is there in your ICU, whose active energy needs are lesser, there the fluid requirements will be lesser. That is why you must have heard all the surgeons and cardiologists say that we never give the full fluid requirement on post-op day 1, 2, or 3. It's always a certain percentage of the maintenance fluids which are calculated and given, and that we'll see in the coming slides also. So what is the calorie requirement? Just an overview. In children, we do everything by their weights, whether it's the fluid calculation, whether it's the electrolyte calculation, whether it's the dose of antibiotics, or whether it's the dose of the electrolytes. So for a 0 to 10 kg child, the calorie requirement is 100 kilocalories per kg per day. Now, for a 10 to 20 kilograms, it is 50 kilocalories per kg per day, plus 1000 kilocalories. And for a more than 20 kilogram weight kid, it is 1500 kilocalories plus 20 calories per kg. Actually, it should be kilocalories. Metabolism of 1 calorie produces only 0.2 ml of water, and it consumes 1.2 ml. So what that means is, as you are consuming the calories, you also need water along with it. Now, so for a post-operative child, what does it mean? Now we cannot remember all these, calories by rote. So we have simplified this formula to mean that on an early basis, a child between 0 to 10 needs 4 ml per kg per hour. A child between 10 to 20 kilogram needs 40 ml plus 2 ml per kg per hour, and a child more than 20 kilograms needs 60 ml plus 1 ml per kg per hour. It's easier to remember this way. Also, if your post-operative child has fever, it increases the calorie requirement by 10 to 20% for every centigrade rise. Why? Because it will consume more water. Now, again, in fluid calculation, in the post-operatively, as I told you, the fluids are restricted because water and sodium are usually retained after cardiac surgery. Most of the congenital cardiac surgery patients are operated on pump. There are very few cases which are done off pump, like pedialization or coarctation, or maybe a Glenn, or maybe these days some people are doing Fontan also off pump. So since most of the cases are done on pump, they tend to retain water and sodium because of the additional pump volume also, and a lot of medications which are given, which include steroids and antibiotic doses which have to be given regularly. Plus there is from the anesthesia side. And while we are coming off, usually the patient is dilated. So the anesthetist and the perfusionist, they end up giving more fluid to the child to come off with normal hemodynamics. So in all kids, although the orders need to be individualized, but general guidelines say that if it's an open heart surgery, you can give up to 50 ml per kg per day. Mind it, please, it is per day. It is not per hour on 0 post-op day. And you can give 60 ml per kg per day on first post-op day and later. And for closed heart surgery patients, like, where we didn't have to use the pump or we didn't open any of the heart chambers, like coarctation, PDA, or off-pump Glenn. So you can give 60 ml per kg per day on 0 post-op day and 70 ml per kg per day on first post-op day and later. Now, this slide is quite self-explanatory. I'll just read it actually here. So volume administration may be necessary during the rewarming phase as peripheral circulatory beds reopen when your patient is first transferred to the ICU. So there are a few principles you have to remember. One is that acute fluid loss, that is the bleeding from chest tubes, etc., should be replaced with equal volumes of fluid. Now you can choose colloid, you can choose packed cells, you can choose fresh whole blood. Now, how do you decide the choice? That we'll deal in a slide later on. Another thing to remember is that the urine output should not be routinely replaced, because on the first day, anyways, the urine output will be depressed. Secondly, or actually, it may actually be increased also because the patient also gets a lot of mannitol on pump. So please don't keep on replacing that urine. The choice of replacement fluid should be guided by the hematocrit and the lesion which is operated. So in congenital cardiac surgery, every patient is different. Now, every patient is different because the cyanotic, there's a lot of variability in the anatomy and physiology for both cyanotic and non-cyanotic lesions. So for every patient, you have to decide how much replacement fluid. You still cannot stick to the formulae, which we have dictated in the previous slides. Now, patients after a repair of cyanotic lesions like Blue-TOF, or patients with persisting cyanosis like single ventricles, they require a higher hematocrit than non-cyanotic patients. So the correct filling pressure is usually the lowest possible filling pressure consistent with adequate cardiac output, and this needs to be titrated to each patient's requirements. Now, neonates, you have to remember, have a limited reserve to compensate once the intravascular space is emptied. Therefore, regular assessment in their case is important, and judicious fuel fluid replacement should be used to anticipate and prevent circulatory collapse. And like I said in single ventricles, some patients, especially after Glenn and Fontan operations, they may require a higher SVC filling pressure to assist forward flow in the early post-operative period. So you will find that Glenn and Fontans, they take a lot of volume in, more than the recommended 4 ml per kg per hour or 3 ml per kg per hour. And you need that to propel the blood flow forward into the pulmonary vascular bed, which still has to get used to the new found pathway by which you are sending the flow into the pulmonary bed. Now, there are various fluids which are available to us for use in pediatrics. This is just to give you an idea of the fluid compositions. As you can see, 5% and 10% dextrose does not have any electrolytes, just glucose, and the level of glucose varies. Now, normal saline has only sodium in it. There is no potassium. Again, N/2 saline has half the quantity of sodium in it, but again, no potassium. And most of the times we used a combination of 5% dextrose with N5 saline. So it will have some sodium, some chloride, some glucose, but again, no potassium. 3% saline is only to be used in hypernatremia. Ringer's lactate, again, we use it very little. We use it only for more than 10 kilo patients in our setup. And Isolite P, although it's a good option, it has good amount of potassium also, but it is quite expensive. So most of the places in our setup where patients are poor, we don't usually use Isolite P. Now, what we do in our setup, this is a slide just to show that for less than 5 kilo patients, we use 5% dextrose or 10% dextrose, or we use half DNS or half NS. For 5 to 10 kilos, we based on the sugar levels or serum sodium. We will make a combination of this. For example, we can use 5% dextrose with 1/4 normal saline, or 10% dextrose with 1/4 normal saline. But our policy is that usually for a smaller patient, we will use 10% dextrose or a higher level of glucose. And just please remember this, that all infusions for less than 10 kilogram patient are to be made in 10% dextrose, just to maintain their glucose level. And here by infusions, I mean all the antibiotics or all the inotropes that you make for these patients, like dopamine, dobutamine, Adri, noradminerenone, or whatever you're using in your setup. Now, some infants, they need a higher concentration of glucose to maintain glucose homeostasis. So this can be achieved by increasing the concentration to 12.5% dextrose in the peripheral line and up to 20% or 25% dextrose in the central line. We don't use generally 25% dextrose in the peripheral line because it can cause thrombophlebitis if it extravasates. Now, when the patient is hemodynamically stable and the hematocrit is adequate, you can commence maintenance fluids once your patient has been shifted into the PICU. Fluid orders should be written as soon as possible, ideally before the admission of the case. And during the initial reforming phase, we use volume expanders, which I mentioned 2 slides ago also. And these volume expanders, they include blood, colloid, plasma, which may be actually necessary initially as soon as your patient has been shifted from OT to support the circulation. Now, how do we choose which volume expanders we are going to use? So it depends both, the criteria is decided both by the patient, which has been operated on, and by the criteria, which is which volume expander and what qualities it has. For example, pump blood, that is the blood which is left over from the bypass machine. Now, this has low hematocrit because of dilution by other factors like whatever the priming volume they have used, and it also will have large amounts of heparin, which may require reversal. So if your patient is already bleeding excessively or his coagulation parameters are deranged, please avoid using the pump blood. Many times the anesthetist or perfusionist say, please use this blood, but please don't use it, especially if the patient's coagulation parameters, for example, ACT, or you have sent a PT-INR, they are deranged, or you are getting enough drainage in chest tubes, which you think does not justify giving exposure to more heparin. The second thing is what you can use is packed red blood cells. You should use it if additional red cell mass is needed. Now, why would you need extra red cell mass? To improve the oxygenation. And so what you use would depend on patient's hematocrit, whether you operated the patient for a cyanotic or a non-cyanotic lesion. Now, you can also use fresh frozen plasma if your patient has coagulopathy or he's still bleeding significantly. But you should also give platelets to this patient, because what FFPs will do is they will just dilute the circulation. But FFPs should not be used for regular routine volume expansion of a post-operative congenital cardiac surgery patient. Now, platelets. Platelets play a very important role because generally what exposure to cardiopulmonary bypass does is it leads to thrombocytopenia and platelet dysfunction. Now, this platelet dysfunction can persist for 3 to 5 days because that is what is the average lifespan of your platelet cell is. So till the old platelets are shunted out from the system and the new ones are born, your patient will still have platelet dysfunction in the ICU. So please consider giving your patient platelets for excessive bleeding, irrespective of the absolute platelet count. So suppose you have sent regular labs like CBC, once your patient has been shifted and you are seeing there is good platelet count, but still the bleeding is not stopping, still think about giving platelets to your patient. Again, it should not be used for routine volume expansion. The other thing you can use is fresh whole blood, but it should not be more than 48 hours old. And you can also use colloids like 5% albumin. The only thing is that although they don't carry the risk of transfusion reactions or infection as other blood products, but they are very costly. And then it has been proven by many studies that they don't persist inside the, the system, the intracellular circulation for a long time, they also have a tendency to extravasate and cause pulmonary edema. Now, so this was to do with the fluids. Now we'll deal with electrolytes one by one. So first we'll take up potassium because it's very important. Potassium homeostasis. Serum potassium may change rapidly due to changes in cardiac output, tissue metabolism, acid-base status, or urine output. The target range is 3 to 4.5. Now we all know that we send ABGs regularly after shifting the patient to the ICU to see their potassium levels. But please remember that the ABG machines, although they are calibrated well, they tend to underestimate the level of potassium by 0.5 to 1 millimoles. So for example, your ABG is showing 4. So it's quite likely that that patient's potassium is actually 4.5 to 5. So please consider that before correcting the potassium level. So it's always recommended that you send the potassium level to the lab and try not to save on the money there. If you have a good level, that will prevent you many adverse complications caused due to unnecessary correction of potassium in the ICU. Now, this is just a generic slide. So if the serum potassium is less than 3 millimole, how much potassium you have to give? If it is between 4.5 to 5.5, then you stop all KCl infusions, including that in the maintenance fluid, and then you repeat serum potassium hourly. Because at higher potassium levels, you can just have VFib or even asystole. And greater than 5.5, you institute the measures described in the next slide. And at that time, you should also check the ECG for tall T waves and other evidence of hyperkalemia. Now, hyperkalemia is actually serum potassium more than 5.5. So what you can do to stop your patient from suffering arrhythmogenic consequences of hyperkalemia is, and this is urgent situation, so you have to give either sodium bicarb 1 to 2 milliequivalents per kg over 10 minutes. You can give calcium gluconate if that is not working. You can give a glucose insulin bolus. You can even do salbutamol or asthalin nebulization. You should stop all blood products transfusion because they have excessive calcium in them. If nothing works, then you can give ion exchange resins perorally or perrectally, although they're kind of slow to work. And if nothing works, then obviously you have the option of dialysis. And in kids, usually we use peritoneal dialysis. Now, hypokalemia, partly we have already dealt with in the previous slide. It's plasma potassium level less than 3 milliequivalents. So maximum infusion you can run at 0.4 milliequivalents per kg per hour. And maximum oral dose that you can give is 1 milliequivalents per kg per dose, if suppose you think it's not that urgent. And one thing you should remember is to supplement magnesium sulfate, if the hypokalemia is resistant. So you check the magnesium levels in the lab. If that is less than 0.7, now every lab has different criteria. Some give a level normal between 2 to 2.2 depending upon the units they are using. Other give a level more than 0.7 is normal depending upon the millimoles unit they are using. So you go by your lab's criteria. If the magnesium is less, please do supplement it and also correct the serum chloride levels. And do not give digoxin in presence of hypokalemia. Then calcium, as I told you in the beginning itself, it's a very important part of dealing with a kid who has had cardiac surgery. Ionized calcium is only 50%, and this is the one which is important for driving your myocardial contractility. So you have to maintain the levels more than 0.9 millimoles per liter. And you will often see that many intensive unit consultants, they have this policy of putting neonates or especially kids less than 5 kilo. Actually, they bring the kids out from OT on calcium infusions itself to improve myocardial contractility because it is expected that calcium may be low post cardiopulmonary bypass due to excessive heparinization. So you can stop, but you have to titrate the calcium infusions properly. Otherwise, even excess of calcium can paralyze your myocardium. If you just want to give a bolus, you can give calcium gluconate 10 to 20 milligrams per kg. You should infuse them into central lines again, as extravasation may cause thrombophlebitis and tissue necrosis. They are incompatible with sodium bicarbonate or citrated blood products. So please don't make sure that they are not going into the same central line. And rapid administration should not be done. It should be given over 5 to 10 minutes because otherwise it may cause bradycardia. Sodium is again very important to deal with and maintain in post-operative patients. So a sodium level less than 130 milliequivalents per liter is what classifies as hyponatremia. You should give direct attention to what is causing this hyponatremia because generally this does not happen. Now, correction should be gradual, slow, and partial. You should not correct in one go, because suppose if you do it, in one go with 3% normal chloride or something, you can have seizures or drowsiness. You can have the same consequences, which could be a result of hyponatremia also. Now, here is a formula which is given. No need to memorize that. You can just, write it down in your diary and somewhere. This is just to tell you how much potassium in milliequivalents would be required. The rate of infusion should be kept from 1 ml per minute to a maximum of 12 ml per kg body weight. Now, rapid correction is associated with pontine myelinosis. This is an MCQ we must have answered many times. Do not increase serum sodium faster than 2 milliequivalents per hour. A normal person needs 4 to 5 milliequivalents per kg per day. So you have to calculate the requirements as per the body weight again. Now, hypernatremia is a serum sodium level more than 150. So what you have to do in case you have a patient with hypernatremia is just increase the free water in the form of 5% dextrose. Stop all sodium chloride infusions in whatever form they may be going, or even if they are going in the feeds, some sort of feeds you have started. Now, total volume in liters to be supplemented additionally, besides the usual fluid requirement, that is the formula, actual sodium divided by desired sodium minus 1 into 0.6 into body weight. Glucose homeostasis is also very important. So here is a sliding scale for rapid administration. Immediately post bypass, please administer it IV. When insulin is given in IV infusion, blood sugar levels have to be measured 1 hourly and the rate of infusion has to be titrated accordingly. But when you are using a subcutaneous infusion sliding scale, you administer insulin 4 hourly and you do the blood sugar levels 4 hourly. So, but post-op day 0, as we have said, please try to give it 1 hourly IV only. And but post-op day 1, you can change it to subcutaneous sliding scale if your blood sugar levels have been well maintained on post-op day 0. Now, this is a sliding scale that we use in our setup. Again, no need to memorize it. It will be available in all the ICUs. And although nutritional support is not directly connected to fluid and electrolytes, but it's an important component for a kid. That is why I've just included this in this presentation. The total calorie requirement for a child, again, as per body weight, is 120 to 150 kilocalories per kg per day. The protein requirement change as the child goes from term infant to older child. And we have to remember that 1 gram of nitrogen gives 6.25 grams of protein gives 1 gram of nitrogen. Now, this is important because we have to monitor their kidney function tests also. Now, how do we calculate the calorie distribution? So whatever feed we are giving to the child, from 50 to 55% of total calorie intake should be coming from carbohydrates. So it's usually glucose infusion when parenteral nutrition is given. Now, the initial glucose infusion rate is 4 to 6 milligram per kg per minute, which increases to 8 to 10 milligram per kg per minute. And it depends on the volume status of the baby. That is why, as you have started your feeds, you have to decrease the fluids which you are giving to the baby. So these two things are intertwined and cannot be actually taken separately or treated separately from each other in the case of kids who undergo congenital cardiac surgery. Now, fats should provide 30 to 35% of calories for the day. If we use intralipid 10%, when parenteral nutrition is given, it is infused at the rate of 0.5 to 1 gram per kg per day. Proteins should be used to provide only 15% of total calories for the day. And it is given as injection aminoven 10% to deliver 2 to 3 grams per kg per day. Now, in case of enteral feeds, usually we add sugar and oil also to the prepared formula. And proteins are supplemented by adding protein concentrates, many of which are commercially available. Then we also add some sort of vitamin supplements to the child, IV or oral, as per the recommended dietary allowance. And we should remember this thing, that the daily requirement of a child, whatever the feed you are giving them, either it's enteral, total parenteral, it should provide this much sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, calcium gluconate, and phosphorus to the child. So the calculations should be based on this and the previous slides, which show how much calories they need in a day. Now, unfortunately, this is a very vast topic. There are many intertwined topics like, how do you deal with blood loss after surgery? Because that will again alter the fluids you are giving. If a patient has low cardiac output syndrome, again, the fluids will change. cardiac tamponade, pulmonary hypertensive crisis, how you deal with single ventricles, how you make your inotropes, and how you do renal dialysis for the renal dysfunction. But since those are very vast topics, we won't be covering them in the talk today. So today we'll just stick to the basic fluid and electrolyte management. And I think that is all for today. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Dr. Zina, for your excellent presentation. I think everyone understand how to manage the fluid and electrolytes in the immediate postoperative period. I have seen one question in the chat box. Everyone thanked you for your nice presentation, and there is one question: what is the choice of fluid in respiratory acidosis in postoperative period? Question from Dr. Mofazzal. Choice of fluid in respiratory acidosis in postoperative period. Dr. Zina.
Sorry, ma'am, I could not hear.
Question is, what is the choice of fluid in respiratory acidosis in postoperative period?
Okay. So
you can see in the chat box.
Chat box. Question and answer. No, chat box. Okay. Yes, ma'am, I got the question.
Yes.
So in congenital cardiac surgery patients, first we have to find what is the cause of respiratory acidosis. See, if the patient is retaining CO2, then first it is less to do with the fluids. It is more to do with your ventilatory management. So first we have to find where this respiratory acidosis is coming from. Is the tidal volume less? Is the rate less? Is the mode on which we have put the patient on ventilator, is the mode adequate or not? For example, generally, if it's a less than 5 kg child, we prefer to put them on SIMV, VC plus PS, PC plus PS. And if it is more than 5 kg, we'll prefer SIMV plus VC plus PS or PRVC mode. So I think if you alter your ventilator properly, the respiratory acidosis will be taken care of. I mean, also you have to check your tubings, whether they are not holding any water in the lines, the tubings are clear or not. Is there any ventilator malfunction or not? So that will not change the choice of fluid per se. We will stick to the same fluids as per their weight requirements, which will be like less than 5 kilo, we'll go with 10% dextrose with 1/4 with half DNS, or for a more than 5 kilo child, we'll stick to half DNS, or we'll stick to this 5% dextrose with 1/4 normal saline.
Thank you, Dr. Zina. Yeah, ask question if you have.
I have a few questions I mentioned in the chat box.
Ashfaq, you can ask question directly. I am not seeing any question in the chat box.
Okay. My first question is, sometimes we have seen in the ICU, the patients having hypernatremia along with acidosis. How will you manage that scenario?
So hypernatremia with acidosis. See, if it is immediately after, generally what happens is hypernatremia is accompanied by metabolic alkalosis. But if you are seeing metabolic acidosis with it, so we have to run our patient through a few checklists, right? First, we have to see whether the patient is dehydrated or not. Are we providing an adequate volume? So is the hypernatremia actually real hypernatremia, or is it pseudo hypernatremia? So first thing is always to send it to the labs, your sodium and potassium levels. You cannot rely on the ABG levels. And for hypernatremia, as we have already dealt with, if you still are able to this thing, we have to treat it as we mentioned in the presentation. I think I'll go back to the slide again if you are seeing. So you are just going to fill them up with free water in the form of 5% dextrose. And anyways, 5% dextrose or 10% dextrose is the fluid of choice for a post-operative pediatric cardiac surgical patient. As far as acidosis is concerned, again, we have to find out from ABG what is causing the acidosis. metabolic acidosis specifically, you have to look at three things: the base deficit, you have to look at PCO2 levels, and you have to look at pH. So suppose pH is less than 7.2, your base acidosis is more than minus 0.5, and your PCO2 level is within the normal range, then you will go for bicarbonate injections. And we don't recommend infusions, continuous infusions. We recommend like bolus injections to control that, and repeat your ABG after half an hour or 1 hour.
Some
Okay, I
other
have
people are
another question.
raising hand.
Ma'am,
Okay,
I have
Ashfaq,
another
your next
question.
question.
How
Okay,
you assess the requirement of fluid after ICR, and what is the guide in a stiff RV?
Okay. So after ICR, it depends. Your ICR was, you used transannular patch, or you went through the RV and you did not open the RVOT at all. So generally what happens is, if you have done a TOF, I'm assuming this is ICR for TOF. Okay, so one is transatrial approach, one is transventricular approach, or through the PA. Okay. Now, if in generally the ones where we have gone transatrially, they tend to behave better than the ones where we have done a ventriculotomy, or where, like we have done, you know, a conduit, we have done a rastally, or where we have gone through the PA and we have put a transannular patch. Now, generally, the problem is not the stiffness in the post-operative patients where you have done a ventriculotomy or where you have put a transannular patch. The problem is that the contractility is not good. It becomes actually kind of dilated. So you generally, a person who has done that, for example, a surgeon like me, we would put some sort of, you should have 2-3 lines to monitor your pressure for that. So one is, the anesthetist has already put the CVP line, which has been most likely put transjugularly, which will give you an estimate of your RA pressure. And I will maybe leave a PA line if I have any doubt as to the, you know, the RV-LV ratio at the end of the procedure. So if I have done an ICR where I have had to put a patch, like a transannular patch, or I've had to do a ventriculotomy to repair the VSD or whatever, then in that case, at the end of the procedure, I will take a line and I will measure the RV pressure, the PA pressure, so that will give me the gradient from RV to PA. And I will also take LV so that I have an RV-LV ratio at the end of it. Now, if the RV-LV ratio is 0.5 or less, then I'm very happy with it. I will not leave a PA line. If, however, the RV-LV ratio that I'm getting is 0.7 or more, then I am a little worried how this patient is going to behave in the post-operatively in the ICU. Then I will leave a PA line. So that PA line will be my guide post-operatively in the ICU as to how I deal with this patient. But generally, such patients, they need more volume than usual to propel the forward flow of blood into your pulmonary tract, which you have just now opened by putting the transannular patch or something. Normally, we will like to stick to the maintenance fluid requirements that I have told you, the 3 ml per kg per hour and 2 ml per kg per hour on the first day, and 3 and 4 on the second and third day respectively. But if your pressures are not holding, in spite of the inotropes you are providing, in spite of the fact that you are taking enough care of the afterload by running dopamine, NORAD, and milrinone, these are my 3 infusions of choice. Milrinone is also required for vasodilatory effect because it helps to dilate the tract and decrease the afterload. It decreases SVR also. Plus, milrinone will also have a good effect on the contractility of the heart. So then I may end up giving more fluids because then I have to increase the preload also. But as I mentioned in one of the slides, you have to ensure that the filling pressure you are giving to your patient is by the least amount of the fluid. Why? Because you don't want your patient to blow up and then to be diuresing on the second and third day, because on the first day when the diuretics are not going to work on your patient. But anyways, where saving patient's life comes, that is a secondary thing. We can anyways take care of it on the second and third day onwards, but try to give more fluids. And generally the ones where you have breached the RV, they will end up taking more fluid. But transatrial repairs generally won't behave like that. They'll be fine.
So your guideline is to optimize the inotrope, then to increase the volume by assessing the CVP.
No, I'm not saying that. Don't increase the volume first. You have to give a bolus, see what the response is coming. Okay. If your CVP is responding to the volume, that means the patient is underloaded. And anyways, after bypass, a patient tends to get dilated more. They drop their SVR, they drop their PVR also. That's a known effect of CPB. So first you see the response to the fluid bolus, but if the patient is not responding to the fluid bolus, your PA pressure from the PA line, which if you have put is also indicating otherwise, then you increase the inotropes.
Okay, my last question is how you manage the fluid in a high flow BT shunt and how you recognize
Sorry, I can't hear you. High flow?
high flow BT
Repeat
shunt.
question.
High flow
how-
BT shunt. Okay.
Yeah, and how you
So-
recognize how high flow BT shunt.
Okay. So what you are, so I will, let me understand this question. By high flow BT shunt, it means that we ended up putting a bigger size shunt. That's what
Yeah,
you are
yeah.
saying? So
Yeah,
suppose the
large-
patient required 3.5 and we ended up 4, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So if it's a
Yes, yes.
surgical mistake, if it's a surgical mistake and we recognize it's a high flow shunt, then I'm really sorry, but as a surgeon, I have to say the best option is to take the patient back and you either put a partial clip on the shunt, okay? Because how much your patient will deal with it. So best thing is you take the patient back to the OT and you put up either a partial clip on it because that will take care of it. And otherwise, you know, you can just put a stitch or two to decrease the flow through it. That is the best way, rather than let your patient suffer through it.
Yes, yes, that is, yeah.
I mean, as
Is
a
there
surgeon,
any question?
Okay,
Any
thank you.
other people have any question? Someone, I saw another one raised hand. I have one question, Dr. Zina. If after ICR of TOF, if there is any residual VSD, which was not seen before by the surgeon, there is additional VSD, what will be your fluid management in that case?
ma'am, generally it is known that the after a TOF, patients tend to tolerate residual VSDs poorly. But again, it depends on the size of the VSD. Suppose like if it's a big VSD, 6 to 7 mm, then there is, and it's good, it's shunting too much, like which we'll be able to see on the echo. Then we
Yes,
have
yes.
we have to repair it. If suppose that it's not divisible, then we have to repair
Yeah.
it. Because I mean, it is a known fact that patients with TOF, like after repair, they tend to tolerate residual VSDs very badly, especially big size.
Yes. Yes. Is there any question from anybody else? Dr. Zina, I just want to know for my student, another thing. If you do a neonatal switch, like a switch on a newborn baby of 2-3 weeks,
Yes, ma'am.
what will be your fluid management in general for that newborn?
Fluid
Like
management.
TGA, yeah, simple type of TGA.
So, ma'am, on shifting, generally it will be 10% dextrose. Actually, I would prefer if there is any, if the patient's hemodynamics are normal, LA pressure is within control, and there is no bleeding issue, then maybe I will give him some blood and some FFP. If there is leftover from the, and generally these patients have leftover
Yeah.
from the OT. So we will prefer to stick to colloid expanders rather than crystalloids. But again, for a switch, since there are so many suture lines, I will make sure that before doing that, the ACT is fine. PT, INR I have sent to the lab and they're also looking okay. And there is not much bleeding coming in the drains. And after a while, once these products are finished, I will start the crystalloid.
Yeah.
I have to take care of the like patient's sugar levels also. And we'll try, and since the child is only
Yeah.
2-3 weeks, I will try to make all the infusions in 10% or some even in 25% dextrose, so as to decrease the volume which the patient will take in.
Yeah.
And everything should be made in double strength or double concentration so that less volume goes to the child.
Okay, thank you. And another question from on behalf of my student, in case of single ventricle repair like Glenn,
Yes, ma'am.
so your patient needs blood flow from the vein to the artery, like from superior vena cava to the pulmonary artery. So is there any policy you follow to encourage veno-arterial circulation in postoperative period?
Yes, ma'am. So generally these patients, first is the, there are 2-3 things which are important in the ICU. One is the Glenn position. We know that the patients have to be nursed upright 45 degrees and to propel the flow of blood. Then the other No, and yes, and the other thing is that the ventilator management is very important in the Glenn patient. So whereas in all other patients we provide a PEEP of 4:5, in this case the PEEP is kept only 0 to 2 to facilitate the flow from vein to an artery. And we will make sure we are always keeping milrinone infusions on in such patients. Many times people get worried about seeing the blood pressure, but milrinone is important in such a patient. So if the systemic pressure is going low, it's better to supplement that with dopamine or something like Adri, but milrinone has to be on at least for the first day.
Yeah. There is another question I am seeing: choice of inotrope at post-op period according to your practice.
Ma'am, I prefer dopamine as my first choice with milrinone. Mostly that works very well, and I like dopamine because it has a renal effect also, so it helps to get a good urine output also in patients. If although the pressure is not sustaining with dopamine, then I would add Adri, and then lastly maybe NORAD.
And milrinone? And after that?
Yes, ma'am. Dopa and milrinone are first choice, and secondly would be
followed by adrenaline.
Adri and followed by NORAD. If NORAD is required.
In your ICU, in your ICU, how long you continue dopamine? Usually we give dopamine maximum for 2 days or 3 days, then we stop that. What is your practice?
Ma'am, for simple cases like ASD, VSD, generally we are able to, so ASDs, VSDs, we'll try to extubate the same day by evening or something. So we are able to wean off dopamine. Sometimes ASDs are not even on dopamine. Like they're able to sustain the pressure and everything. VSDs generally, if they're extubated and everything, next morning we are able to wean it off. For TOF, again, like one of the fellows asked me a question. So generally for transatrials, they get extubated earlier. That is what I have seen. And so if they're extubated the same day or next morning, then by next evening, we'll try to stop dopamine. And if it's a transventricular or a transannular patch patient, sometimes they might take more than a day to get extubated. And if so, whatever after extubation, we just give a gap of like 5 to 6 hours to observe their hemodynamics. Then we start weaning to see the child's consciousness level, hemodynamics. If everything is fine, then we'll start weaning. Once we are reassured that
dobutamine
won't be required.
Yeah, so you don't use dobutamine that much?
Ma'am, dobutamine only selective, because what dobutamine does is it drops the pressure very much. Like I have seen many times that we give dobutamine and the pressure starts dropping. So although it dilates and it has good contractility effect, but it will drop the pressure. So that, sends up a lot of alarms in the ICU. I mean like everyone gets alarmed and they start doing a lot of things in panic.
Okay. Another question I'm seeing here is, in failing heart, how long you use dopamine? So this question is also already answered. In failing heart, how long you use inotropes? So as long as heart is
as long as
failing,
it is required,
you have to use.
Yes, as long as required.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it was a very nice discussion on fluid and electrolyte management. And Dr. Zina, we would like to hear from you about other issues which you have mentioned in your last slide, that there are low cardiac output syndrome and many other things, intermingling issues, and fluid management and electrolyte management changed with those situations. So we will hear from you again in another lecture. And this one is especially a very interesting one, especially for those who are working in the with the post-operative patients, especially the fellows who are posted in post-operative setup for their duties. So I think this is a very good one. If anyone want to add anything more, can add, or we will stop here. Another question I am seeing: after cardiocentesis, more than 200 ml in a patient who was in a maintenance fluid, is there any fluid requirement? I don't understand actually the question. In the chat box, Zina, if you understand, after pericardiocentesis, maybe he is mentioning that 200 ml of fluid, withdrawal of fluid,
Okay.
do you need any change in the maintenance fluid?
Oh,
Question
more
is
than
not that
200
clear.
ml.
If there is pericardial effusion or there is a collection of fluid in the pericardial sac and 200 ml is removed, is
Okay.
there any need for replacement?
Okay. So I actually see if we are talking about a post-operative cardiac surgical patient, first of all, that patient should not have that much fluid around the heart because that patient already has chest tubes or chest drains. If you are in a situation where you have had to drain 200 ml, you have to do a cardiocentesis, that means your patient was in cardiac tamponade. So this is not, this situation is not possible actually.
Yeah.
Like, you try to understand. See, if you're talking about some other patient, like
Yeah.
you have done some intervention or cardiology, something, I can understand this question. But post-operatively, it does not happen like this.
Yeah, this is a new fellow, possibly.
Madam, I'm just clearing it. We have a patient of pericardial
Is it
effusion.
post-operative?
No, madam, it is not post-operative.
Yes,
It is
Mofazzal.
diagnosed-
It
the patient who have underwent
is a
pericardial stentosis,
non.
we have drained more than 200 ml of fluid from the pericardial sac. He was NPO for several hours on maintenance fluid. Is there any addition of fluid is required or not in that patient?
Okay. What is the diagnosis actually for this kid?
Pericardial effusion with a heart failure and anemia.
Okay. Does the child have cardiomyopathy or something also?
Yes, dilated cardiomyopathy.
So see, now we are stuck like between, it's like being stuck between the mountain and the valley, because you're for a patient who has dilated cardiomyopathy, you have to give fluids very carefully, because the more fluid you give, you will precipitate heart failure, and that heart failure will again cause this pericardial effusion. So there you have to see the hemodynamics of the patient. If the patient has maintained the hemodynamics, like he has maintained the blood pressure, heart rate, there is no sign of bradycardia, there is no drop in urine output, you must have done some BBG or ABG and that was okay, then you don't need to give extra 200 ml, because here in this case, the patient also has dilated cardiomyopathy. If the patient is fine on that maintenance fluid, it's fine. The only advice is that when we are doing pericardiocentesis in a patient with dilated cardiomyopathy, we should just take the fluid out like in little aliquots. We should not drain 200 ml in one go. Because although for an adult 200 ml is not that much, for a kid 200 ml is a lot of fluid. That's all we can do.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we have a very good discussion, and I would like to thank everyone for your presence. Even in the evening, in the afternoon of Ramadan, all of you were hungry, thirsty, and all of you were tired. Even then, you have attended. I saw two of the participants raised hand. I have not. Anybody want to say anything? Two participants raised hand. You can unmute and you can ask directly. Dr. Aziz Al Maqsood, he thanks you for your excellent presentation. And what are the most common, his question is, what are the most common biochemical abnormalities occur during post-surgical period? And what are the most challenging events and intensivist phase?
Sorry, ma'am.
Commonly after a bypass.
What are the most common biochemical abnormalities? Okay, during post-surgical period. So the most common biochemical abnormality we can say will concern potassium. That's why dealing with potassium is very important. Most of the times it's hypokalemia. I have rarely seen hyperkalemia. So management of hypokalemia is very important. And the most challenging event an intensivist can face after a bypass operation in a child, I would say, is low cardiac output syndrome. So that we'll discuss in some other talk. It won't be per se pertaining to the fluid and electrolytes, but yes, definitely. As far as low cardiac output syndrome is concerned, that is something where you have to deal with a child for 5 to 7 days in bad conditions. And we know the prognosis is not very good if you don't manage the child properly.
Another question is, you are seeing MD Abdul Hannan, Dr. Abdul Hannan.
Yes.
His question is, how does hyperkalemia affect digoxin? Maybe interaction between hypokalemia and digoxin, he want to know.
Okay, so what I said was we don't give digoxin to a hypokalemic patient because that causes, as we all know, digoxin toxicity. So that was the basic simple thing.
Yeah.
It's like the MCQ we answer when we give PG exams. So just was trying to reinforce that.
Yeah, I think that's all about all the question. You have answered very nicely all the question, and next time in your second lecture on the same topics, I think they will be able to learn many things from you. So thank you again, everyone, for your nice presence. And let us stop here today. And please stay safe, take care of yourself, take care of your patient, take care of your family members, and stay safe and complete your vaccines as early as possible. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure hearing your voice.
It was a pleasure for me also.